Mark chapter 14. If you want to follow along in the blue Bibles that are around the space, it's page 1580. If you're a type of person that likes to take notes or at least know where we are in the sermon, there are sermon outlines at the end of every row. You can pick those up and follow along and jot down some notes. I will say, in way of appreciation, I got some funny feedback this week. Apparently, whether it's at coffee hour or during the week, because I've been here for a year and we're sort of getting used to each other. I'm learning about you as a congregation. You're learning about me as a minister. And apparently a common theme is people will say, that was a really interesting sermon, or I've never heard some of that before. I don't necessarily agree with it, but it was interesting. And I just want to say, that's fine. I know that that's my style, and I say that just to let you know that if that has been your experience up to this point, you should buckle up because today I might come from an angle that you're not familiar or comfortable with. I thought I should just give you fair warning. We are reading some very familiar texts, and we're going to begin in verse 32. They went to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." He took Peter, James, and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death," he said to them. "Stay here and keep watch." Going a little further, he fell to the ground and prayed that if possible, the hour might pass from him. "Abba, Father," he said, "everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me. Yet not what I will, but what you will." Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. "Simon," he said to Peter, "are you asleep? Could you not watch for 1 hour? Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the body is weak." Once more he went away and prayed the same thing. When he came back, he found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. They did not know what to say to him. Returning a third time, he said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Enough! The hour has come. Look, the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." It's always interesting for me when we get to these texts that we're so familiar with because they're part of our Easter week celebration. If you were here last Good Friday, we had a very dramatic, sort of a theatrical presentation of these types of texts. And so when we are preaching through the Gospel of Mark, say in the summer, and it's not Easter, I always try and think like, how do we do this well where we're not so overly familiar with the story that we lose some of the details? And one of the things I've been thinking about leading up to addressing these Easter week stories is, I don't know if you've ever noticed this, if you've ever read through one of the Gospels or if you've read through the Gospel of Mark before, but Easter week takes a disproportionate amount of the text. For all of Jesus' amazing life and teachings and miracles, that 1 week of his life takes up almost as much space as the rest of his life gets. It's really out of proportion in one sense. And I've actually looked into a number of different theories about why this is. I've thought about it from a movie standpoint. If you've ever been watching a movie and it's sort of fast-paced, and then maybe it gets into, if you've ever watched an action movie where it gets to like a car scene, and the car scene takes forever, and even though it's a really good scene, you're like, we get it, move on, right? That's how I feel about these texts sometimes. It's like a really good movie that gets bogged down in this one sequence. And so I've looked into why people think that this has happened. There's a couple theories I want to tell you about because I think they're interesting. One is that because these Gospels were written so much later, like maybe up to 30 years, 40 years later, that the way that the communities or the authors constructed the story had more to do, not so much as like a newspaper report, like a blow-by-blow account of what happened, but because of what had happened in the years, the decades since then, what did the community of faith need to know? And so they prioritized things that were happening in their time. That's the part of the story that they emphasized as they wrote down and formed these Gospels. So whether it was persecution or prayer or rebellion, right, whatever it was, that those elements get highlighted in the story, the way that this narrative comes to us. And so there's a whole thing, a whole branch of scholarship that studies what was going on in the early churches and why they may have chosen to tell us the story the way that they did. It had far more to do with what was going on in their time than about getting the story 100% linear and accurate. So I think that's an interesting thing. I don't necessarily delve into that a bunch, but knowing that that branch of scholarship is there is actually really helpful to me, and sometimes it really illuminates something going on in the text where I'm like, oh, that's why they're making such a big deal out of this. So that's good. A second branch of scholarship emphasizes the anti-imperial aspect of the story, that Jesus lived in a time where a foreign military occupation had invaded their land and had dominated them. They were basically slaves inside their own country. And so that anti-empire emphasis comes through over and over in this Easter week stories. In fact, some of the details that are thrown in, like this mock trial that Jesus has to go through before Pilate and the other officials, it's like sometimes it feels like there are too many details and they're sort of unnecessary. It's like it overdone. But if you read it through an anti-empire lens, it sort of makes sense because Jesus is demonstrating and modeling a way of being, a way of interacting in the world that is subversive and counter the systems of power and the legal structures, the religious structures of his day. He's being a revolutionary, and he's modeling and demonstrating that, exposing the injustice in the system. And so reading it through an anti-imperial lens is a very interesting way of reading the text. A third thing that I've become really aware of is the danger of vampires. So Dallas Willard, I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He was a really thoughtful writer about Christian spirituality. One of the things he warned about in one of his books was that we live in a time where some people's relationship to Jesus was in danger of being, he called it vampire Christianity, where they were interested in Jesus' blood and little else. And for that reason, I actually am very grateful for all of the details that we have in the gospel, because from time to time, I will meet somebody who goes usually to a pretty conservative church. It may even be like Reformed or Calvinist in its approach, right? But it may just be like evangelical or charismatic or whatever, fundamentalist in some branch. But they have been taught that there's this thing called penal substitutionary atonement, that Jesus died, right, the way that he did for our sins, and that's what makes us good with God, right? And it's very legal, that's the penal part, and it's substitutionary, that God poured out God's wrath on Christ so that we could be forgiven. And in some circles, it's a very popular way of understanding our text. The problem is that Jesus modeled for us life. He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And sometimes what has happened is that people are very much interested in Jesus' death and resurrection because of what it has done for them, right? In a transactional, right? That's the substitutionary thing. But haven't embraced doing it Jesus' way. Because when Jesus says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life, It's as important when you think you have the truth, it's as important that you hold that Jesus' way as it is that you have the truth. It's great to have the truth or feel like truth is on your side. But Jesus' way is a different way in the world. And I'm glad that what we have is a story where we get to see Jesus' life and teachings and interactions with people. Because the honest truth is, Jesus could have died any number of ways, right? And God raised him from the dead, and the exact same thing, redemption, would have happened, right? The sinless for the sinful. Same thing. I mean, Jesus literally in one of these crowds that he was in, somebody could have slipped up behind him and put a knife between his ribs and killed him that way. He didn't need, in that sense, to die on a cross. This public spectacle of humiliation and terror, right? That's what the cross is. It's terrorism. It's a terror device. He didn't need that in order for us to be redeemed. Those elements of the story are the anti-empire elements of the story. Redemption could have happened no matter how Jesus. He could have died of old age. God raised him from the dead, and redemption happened. So when people get too fixated on Jesus' blood, there is an element that makes me nervous, and I'm glad that what we have is a story about life and his teachings and his model of ministry, and what we don't have is just a transaction of a sacrificial lamb. I'm very grateful for that, actually. And the last thing I want to mention is I love people who use this scholar, this thinker. His name was Rene Girard, and he had this scapegoat theory of how society works and how the Gospels tell us how Jesus died. I love this idea that in the cross, God essentially holds up a mirror to the world and says, do you see what you do? Even to me, do you see what you do? Stop it. It is finished. And in that scapegoat, the mirror theory, if you will, that Jesus exposes the violent mechanisms within the system that scapegoat people and says, Father, forgive them. They don't even know what they're doing. And so this model of this mirror, the scapegoat, is one of my favorite things. I want to keep reading here. Verse 43. Just as he was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, appeared. With him was a crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard. Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, Rabbi, and kissed him. The men seized Jesus and arrested him. Then one of those standing near drew his sword back and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Am I leading a rebellion, Jesus said, that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I was with you teaching in the temple courts, and you didn't arrest me. But the scriptures must be fulfilled. Then everyone deserted him and fled. A young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. There's a couple interesting things that happen in this text, this famous text. One is obviously Judas gets named as the betrayer. The other is that Mark generously leaves off that Peter is the one who chops off the guard's ear. Some of the other gospel writers aren't so kind. They out Peter. Mark leaves it anonymous here. But I love that Jesus says, so he takes the swing, he cuts off an ear, and Jesus goes, guys, what are we doing here? What's going on? I used to really dislike Judas. I don't know if it's because I'm the oldest son in my family and loyalty means a lot to me. I don't know if it's because I was idealistic when I was a younger minister training, but I really, really disliked Judas. And then about 8 or 9 years ago, I found this book called Binding the Strong Man. It's a political reading of the Gospel of Mark. And as I read through it, because it's an enormous book, as I read through it and I began to understand Jesus' vision of a different kingdom, right? A counter kingdom, a revolutionary kingdom, an insurrection, you might call it. If you take the time to read through an entire gospel, one of the things you might encounter is that Jesus talks a lot. He says a lot of things. And I became more sympathetic with Judas because I know that it gets portrayed that he betrayed him, and he did. Obviously, he turns him over. But there's a part of me that has become more understanding of Judas, because if you are the type of person who's a person of action, there comes a point at which you say, enough talking, right? Let's put our money where our mouth is. It's go time. And I have a suspicion, and I've read others who have the same, that what Judas was trying to do wasn't necessarily to get Jesus killed. It was to light the match that caused the explosion. He was trying to push Jesus into the confrontation that he thought was coming. Like, all right, enough, we get it, let's go. So whether you say, I grew up with some funny sayings like, fish or cut bait, poop or get off the pot, right? There are a lot of sayings like this. But there comes a point at which I think Judas was trying to spark the ignition to blow up the thing that they had been talking about for somewhere between 1 and 3 years. And I'm a little sympathetic to Judas. And people say, oh, come on, he betrayed Jesus. Yeah, hold on though. But Peter denied him. Paul murdered Christians. The guy we call Doubting Thomas took the gospel to India and maybe as far as China, and the gospel of Thomas is still preached to this day in that part of Asia. So there are redemption stories, and I think if Judas had made it through this ordeal, he could have been a redemption story. I know he gets portrayed a certain way, and I get that. But there's a part of me that's a little bit sympathetic to him that says he may not have understood what he was betraying Jesus into. He may have thought he was helping him by stopping right? All the talking with no action. Like there comes a point where you gotta walk the walk. You can't just talk the talk. And he was trying to initiate what he thought was the coming revolution. It's just a different reading of Judas. The last thing I want to comment on here is in verse 51, a young man wearing nothing but linen garment was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. Does anybody know who that was? This anonymous young man? Anybody know who he was? It's Mark. Mark makes a cameo in his own gospel. It's one of those weird little quirky details where Mark didn't want to have too much of the spotlight. Like, and then I showed up. I was there, man. I was there. So he puts himself in the story in a non-celebrated role, right? Not the hero of the story. He actually counts himself among those who abandoned Jesus and fled. He is stripped of his covering, right? Of his facade. And in this sort of poetic way, he puts himself in the story as this young man who abandons Jesus. He flees and is exposed, left naked, right? He wasn't faithful. He didn't stand by. But it's an interesting little detail that Mark was a young man who had been following Jesus around. And then when the fire meets the fan, he, like everyone else, leaves Jesus alone. Those are some interesting little details in the text. We're not going to take time this week to read the trial before the Sanhedrin. If you want to read that, you can. I know some of you are reading in Mark for Everyone. Enjoy that. If you're following along in Binding the Strong Man, you can go ahead and take time to read this. But I just wanted you to know that we've invested so much time in reading the Gospel of Mark up to this point that sometimes we become very familiar with the text and we miss some of the fascinating details that are tucked in or embedded in the little creases and crevices. So I just wanted to lift those up and highlight them for you. If you have anything that was sparked, any questions, any comments, anything you want to follow up on, you can either write it here on the sermon notes. There's a place for questions. If you want the question to get to me, you have to write it on the pew, the yellow pew card, and put it in the offering plate, and it'll get into my inbox. But I'm going to leave a moment for you to reflect, and then we're going to sing when it's time. This is the table of grace, and prepare for taking communion together.